Good afternoon. I'm Tom Neer, chair of the Terry Lecture Committee, professor of ecology and evolutionary biology, and curator of ichthyology at the Yale Peabody Museum. The Dwight H. Terry Lectureship, established at Yale in 1905, represents a unique intersection of science and religion. Through this prestigious platform, we explore life's most profound questions about existence, morality, and the human spirit. Over its rich history, the lectureship has hosted luminaries such as Carl Jung, George Gaylord Simpson, one of my favorites, Margaret Mead, and more recently, Judith Farquhar, whose insights are preserved in influential published works resulting from these lectures. Today, we are privileged to welcome Peter Adamson, professor of late ancient and Arabic philosophy at Munich's Ludwig Maximilian University. Professor Adamson brings a remarkable breadth of expertise, having taught at King's College London and King's College Cambridge, and King College London. Okay, I should have stuck with my notes. Thank you. And earning his BA from Williams College and his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. His scholarly contributions are both deep and wide-ranging, including definitive works on al-Kindi and al-Razi, and essential contributions to our understanding of Arabic philosophy. But perhaps Professor Adamson is best known for democratizing philosophical knowledge through his acclaimed podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. This extraordinary project, spanning over 800 episodes and reaching millions of listeners, exemplifies his rare ability to make complex philosophical ideas accessible while maintaining scholarly excellence. His work has been particularly groundbreaking in illuminating philosophical traditions overlooked in Western academia. With over 36 million podcast downloads and a corresponding book series with Oxford University Press, Professor Adamson has demonstrated that rigorous academic work can resonate far beyond university walls. His commitment to collaborative scholarship and inclusive education makes him an ideal Terry lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Adamson.
Okay, so thank you so much, Tom, for that lovely introduction. And thanks to the Terry Committee for inviting me. And thanks also to Brenna and everyone else who helped organize these lectures. Also thanks to Yale University Press, who've already been talking to me about the book that will result from this. I'm very happy to be here. So I was asked to give the Terry lectures and was of course very pleased to be asked, and then thought, oh God, but what am I going to say? And I thought that it was obvious I should say something about the themes of the lecture series, so science, religion, philosophy, from the point of view of global philosophy, which is really what I do. So I will be offering you some snapshots of some philosophical issues from a range of global philosophical and religious traditions over the next 3 days. So we're going to be looking at texts from ancient Greek and Latin philosophy, Arabic philosophy, both Jewish and Muslim, Chinese philosophy, and Indian philosophy. I apologize to fans of other traditions for not including those. So maybe I'll get some Africana philosophy or Korean philosophy or something into the book. So the 3 lectures are really kind of drafts of chapters, and they're on pretty specific topics. So before I jump into that, I wanted to give you my current thinking about the sort of payoff message of the book as a whole, which is basically to say something about the nature of religion in relation to skepticism. So I think nowadays we tend to think that religion is anti-skeptical. So we have this idea that religion depends on faith. You could even think about faith. I mean, of course, this would be the topic of a whole lecture, right? But a first stab at what faith might be is a lack of skepticism, right? We even talk about a leap of faith. So you're not going to let doubts worry you. You're going to sort of leap over all the doubts to faith, right? Whereas we think of science as being characterized by skepticism. we think of science as demanding evidence, and even as thinking of its conclusions as provisional once the evidence is in. So this is a kind of general idea that scientists should suspend judgment about their findings even once they've got pretty strong evidence, because science is always open to revision, whereas religious belief is not open to revision, right? It might even be thought to be definitive of religious belief that it's not open to challenge, that it shouldn't be doubted, and so on, right? I'm not saying that this is necessarily correct. I'm just saying that this is a way that we tend to think about the difference between religion and science nowadays. And I think a sign of how fundamental this is that if you take philosophers who are working within a religious tradition, who maybe even seem very, very different from each other, they might both be committed to this. So for example, Søren Kierkegaard and Alvin Plantinga, who was actually at Notre Dame when I did my PhD there. So Kierkegaard, I'm not going to try to give you an adequate summary of Kierkegaard in 30 seconds. I'm sort of tempted to say, if you know anything about Kierkegaard, you kind of know why he illustrates the point I'm making. And if not, then I'm not going to be able to get it across to you right now. But so for example, he thinks that that there's something absurd at the heart of Christian religious belief, and that's kind of why you should believe it. Or you should believe it despite its being absurd, or as I say, even because it's absurd, right? That's what's characteristic of religious belief. Alvin Plantinga is someone who thinks that you could believe in God without any evidence because it is, as he says, properly basic. So you can, just as you can believe that you had eggs for breakfast this morning without any evidence for that, you just kind of know that it's true, you remember that it's true, and you're not thinking of your memory as evidence that it's true, right? You just know that it's true. It's basic, a basic belief for you. And it's properly basic because it's rational to believe it in that way. So you could just believe in God as a fundamental commitment of your life, and people aren't allowed to say that you're being irrational because you're believing in God in that way, right? So I think actually that's very characteristic of a lot of religious believers over the last, let's say, 300-400 years. And because that's been a characteristic way of thinking about religion in opposition to science for such a long time, so much longer than any of us have been alive, we overlook that this has not always been the case. Maybe it's not even the case in other places of the world even now, but my lectures are going to be about what I know, which is pre-modern philosophy. So I'm really only going to be talking about thinkers up till the early 17th century. I think the latest philosopher I mentioned, other than Kierkegaard and Plantinga, is going to be Descartes. So what I want to argue in the book as a whole, and you'll sort of see sort of glimpses of this idea in the lectures over the next 3 days, is that in pre-modern philosophical traditions, and I mean pre-modern philosophical and religious traditions all around the world, religious belief was often assumed to be characterized by skepticism, not because it doesn't have a high epistemic status, but because the beliefs that we have in religion are such that they kind of go beyond reason, right? So they go beyond the sphere of giving evidence, perhaps, and they maybe even outstrip our own ability to understand them, right? So whatever God knows about himself is something we can't know. And so even though, in some sense, religious beliefs are in themselves very certain, we should be modest about them, right? We don't really know the nature of God, for example. And we're going to see several examples of this in the coming days. By contrast, scientists, and of course that's a contested term, what scientists would mean in the pre-modern context, scientists are often very sure of themselves in the pre-modern world. In a way, Plantinga acknowledges this because he says, oh, well, back in the day, religious thinkers like Aquinas were very sure about themselves when they were doing philosophy because they were foundationalists. So he thinks of himself as not being a foundationalist because he doesn't believe in like hardcore laws of reason or principles that are given by reason. He thinks of himself as believing by faith. So the overall picture I want to give you is that religious traditions all around the world were very open to the idea of skepticism, and they kind of saw philosophers as being too sure of themselves, right? So they were saying, well, we're just humans, right? The gods know much more than we do, so we should be really modest about our truth claims. Whereas the Aristotelian philosophers were coming along and saying, well, no, our entire science is based on absolutely certain apodictic first principles. We know these things for sure, right? So basically the idea is that things have swapped around. Religion used to be skeptical, and now it's dogmatic. Science used to be dogmatic, and now it's skeptical. That's kind of the overall picture. But that's not the topic of any of the three lectures. That's more like the frame in which the three lectures sit. So the three lectures are all written, so I'm going to read them out as scripts. And the first one is about a kind of fundamental problem. I was telling my daughter what it's about earlier today, and I said the topic of the first lecture is, why does God allow us to be so ignorant? And she said, oh, if you find out, let me know. I told her I would quote this and that it would probably get the biggest laugh of the evening, which it just has. Okay, so here we go. In the fourth of his meditations, René Descartes says, there is no doubt that God could have given me a nature such that I was never mistaken. Is it then better that I should make mistakes than that I should not do so? It's a fair question. Why does God make us go through the laborious process of acquiring knowledge and leave us prone to error as we go through this process? Such a God would be a kind of mirror image of the evil demon, whose possibility is used earlier in the meditations to induce radical doubt. Whereas the evil demon would ensure that our beliefs are systematically false, this version of God would ensure that our beliefs are systematically true. Even better, he could even give us certain knowledge about everything, so not merely true beliefs, but knowledge, right? So why doesn't God just sort of point his divine finger at us and make us know everything? That's the question Descartes is asking. To be fair, on Descartes' telling, God has given us quite a bit of help. We are created with the natural light of reason, which allows us to identify certain clear and distinct ideas that can be used as the basis for philosophy and science. God is even responsible for implanting these resources in us, according to Descartes' notorious doctrine of innate ideas. Still, it seems that he could have done more for us, given that he's omnipotent. So Descartes' speculation that it must be, for some reason, better that we make mistakes is a reasonable thing to wonder. Descartes' puzzle is, I think, an underappreciated one. I propose calling it the problem of ignorance, in deliberate parallel to the much more widely discussed problem of evil. In contemporary philosophy of religion, the problem of evil is framed as an objection to the existence of an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God. The presence of evil and suffering in the world is either outright inconsistent with the existence of such a God, that's usually called the logical problem of evil, or it's at least strong evidence against the existence of such a God, that's sometimes called the evidential problem of evil. In Descartes' time, though, atheism was only just on the verge of becoming a position anyone could take seriously. So for him, and for earlier philosophers, the problem of evil functioned slightly differently. The challenge was not to defend God's existence, but to explain why evil exists in a world we already know to have been made by a good God. This may sound like just the same problem from the other end, or with a different emphasis, but there is a difference, as we can see from the fact that in modern-day philosophy of religion, at least with respect to the logical problem of evil, about whether God is outright inconsistent with evil and suffering, it would suffice to describe any possible scenario in which evil and God could coexist. So, for example, when Alvin Plantinga is talking about the problem of evil, he says, okay, you can explain evil because of free will. And then he says, oh, but what about natural evils like disease and earthquakes? And he says, oh, that's just caused by demons, which is a terrible answer, right? And then he says, I know that sounds like a terrible answer, but it's logically possible. So I've shown that the existence of God is logically compatible with the existence of evil, right? In the pre-modern context, that kind of move would not be enough. Instead, what was wanted was what Leibniz called a theodicy, a good reason why God has allowed evil to exist when he might have done otherwise. The same goes for the problem of ignorance, as we can see from Descartes' way of formulating it. He speculates that it must be somehow better that we make mistakes. To answer the problem would be to offer what we might call an epistemic theodicy, a robust, I just invented that phrase, by the way. Actually, both the phrases the problem of ignorance and epistemic theodicy were invented for this very lecture you're hearing right now, although I haven't Googled to see if anyone else has used them before, but as far as I know, I invented them. So what would be an epistemic theodicy? It would be a robust explanation of why God has declined to bestow knowledge on us for free, as it were, instead of creating us in ignorance. Now, it might be objected that the problem of ignorance is not really a parallel to the problem of evil. Rather, the problem of ignorance is just a specific case of the problem of evil, because ignorance is just one kind of evil. If this is right, the problem of ignorance calls for no special solution. It will be solved by any traditional theodicy, which would explain why there's ignorance, but also suffering, disease, and so on, all at one fell swoop. My response to this objection is twofold. First, a historical one. Some pre-modern thinkers did think about the problem of ignorance in its own right, and offered theodicy-style arguments addressed specifically to the phenomenon of ignorance, as opposed to suffering, disease, and so on. And this seems worthy of study. No doubt many examples could be given, but I'm going to focus on just three from three different religious traditions: the Christian, Augustine, the Jewish Saadia Gaon, and the Jain Umasvati. So that's my first answer. My second answer is that, as we'll see by considering these examples, the problem of ignorance need not be understood as a specific case of the problem of evil or as a parallel to it, but as being in the end identical to the problem of evil. This would arise for thinkers like the ones we'll be looking at here, who are what I would call strong intellectualists. So for them, ignorance is not just one evil among many, but the source of all evil, because they think that all goodness and salvation comes from knowledge. They correspondingly think that all evil and suffering comes from ignorance. So the problem of evil and the problem of ignorance just collapse into one another. We'll see that towards the end of the lecture. As with the traditional problem of evil, there are several ways to approach the problem of ignorance. I want to consider three. The first, did the slide just change? No, it didn't, did it? There we go. I want to consider three approaches. The first is that ignorance is a form of punishment. We find this in Augustine, for whom human foolishness is the result of a choice made by Adam and Eve, which has corrupted human nature ever since. So this is the famous free will defense. So evil, we get evil as a punishment, or suffering as a punishment for choices made in the past by free will. A second response has it that it is unreasonable to demand of God that he give us complete knowledge. This would be against human nature, so such a complaint would be like asking why God didn't give triangles more than 3 sides. We'll see that Augustine also makes place for this idea, using it to explain the prelapsarian condition of Adam and Eve. Saadia Gaon's solution runs along the same lines. Third, the reason for ignorance might lie in the nature of knowledge itself, and this is what we'll find in Umasvati. For him, ignorance arises because people latch on to just a part of knowledge. A more exalted perspective is needed to achieve perfect knowledge, which is multi-perspectival because of the multifarious nature of existence. These three responses to the problem of ignorance track traditional answers to the problem of evil. Augustine's appeal to original sin is, of course, a free will defense, like arguing that evil exists because of bad choices made by humans. The second answer, that human nature implies ignorance, is analogous to theodicies that affirm the goodness of the created world while also acknowledging its limitation. Only God is fully perfect, so if he makes anything else apart from himself, it will necessarily be imperfect. This is also Aquinas' solution to the problem of evil, for example. The third answer, meanwhile, is akin to theodicies that appeal to the goodness of the universe as a whole. Local phenomena may strike us as undesirable. This child is sick, that man is a tyrant. But from a divine perspective, one would see that all things are providentially ordered and that these apparent evils are in fact necessary parts of a whole that is good. These parallels are in a way unsurprising. Whether the problem of ignorance is a parallel to the problem of evil, a specific case of it, or in the end identical to it, we would expect similar responses to emerge for both. Okay, so let's turn to the free will theodicy of Augustine, which is usually considered a solution to the problem of evil, but as I've already suggested, can equally be understood as a solution to the problem of ignorance. From Augustine's vast oeuvre, I have selected for special attention his work on free choice of the will. This was composed relatively early in his career, which is important. Everything I'm about to say applies specifically to an Augustine who is still under the sway of Platonism and has not yet confronted Pelagianism, this being the view that humans can merit salvation without needing a special gift of grace from God. So as a lot of you probably know, Augustine rejects Pelagianism, so he insists on the need for divine grace to merit salvation. And this is going to be an Augustine who hasn't yet got that on his radar. In fact, Augustine wrote a work later on in which he retracts views from his earlier works. And there's a long section in which he goes through this work on free choice of the will and says, I should have expressed myself more clearly here because I sound like a Pelagian, oops. So he's kind of embarrassed by this later on. He, of course, still insists that he meant that we need grace, right? He just wasn't always pointing it out. One might already detect a Platonic inheritance in the dialogue form of the work, though Cicero would have been a more direct inspiration. Augustine depicts himself in conversation with his friend Evodius. By Augustine's own account in his spiritual autobiography, The Confessions, Evodius converted to Christianity before he did. But here in On Free Choice of the Will, Augustine is clearly the intellectual superior, while Evodius is cast in the role of curious and cooperative student, whose questions drive the conversation. The character of Augustine also frequently poses objections to himself, too, which is how the problem of ignorance comes up towards the end of the dialogue, as in this passage. Many people think they're being quite clever by posing this question. If the first human was created wise, why was he led astray? And if he was created foolish, why isn't God the cause of all vices, since folly is the ultimate vice? Augustine's response is that Adam and Eve were created in a state between wisdom and foolishness, and with a will that enabled them to defy the commandment of God. He compares this state to that of a newborn baby, who is obviously not wise, but whom it seems strange to describe as foolish. One might fairly describe Adam and Eve as ignorant in the sense that they lack knowledge, or at least the sort of knowledge that would have prevented them from falling into sin. But Augustine seems to use the term ignorance as a synonym for the term foolishness. For instance, he says that those who inherit original sin are born into ignorance, difficulty, and mortality. For us, in our fallen state then, ignorance is not just a morally neutral lack of knowledge. It is, as he puts it, separation from truth and wisdom, which Augustine equates with having a perverse will that loves inferior things. In another Platonic, but also Stoic, inheritance, Augustine adheres to the intellectualist position that if one truly knows what is good, one will always choose it. This aspect of Augustine's thought has been explored by Sarah Byers, who says that for Augustine, free will itself may be defined as the power to give or refuse assent to the sentential content of an impression. So that just means that the bad use of free will, which is the same thing as sin, is assenting to the wrong propositions. So it's just forming the wrong beliefs, just like the Stoics would say. So in particular, evil, he says, is turning away from eternal things, which the mind perceives and enjoys by means of itself and which it cannot lose if it loves them, and instead pursuing temporal things, which are perceived by means of the body. Thus, ignorance or foolishness is for the mind to turn away from better things and toward worse things, while wisdom is cleaving instead to the good. Sounding much like Plato in the Republic, Augustine says that it is only in the wise that the mind has control, which is to say, control over irrational impulses. In the absence of such wisdom, the mind is inevitably seduced by the siren call of bodily desires. When desire rules over it, the mind is dragged by inordinate desire into ruin and poverty, now taking false things for true, and even defending those falsehoods repeatedly, now repudiating what it had once believed and nonetheless rushing headlong into still other falsehoods, now suspending judgment and often shying away from clear arguments, now despairing completely of finding the truth and lingering in the shadows of foolishness, now trying to enter the light of understanding, but reeling back in exhaustion. A passage which reveals a lot about the way Augustine writes, like it's very cool, but also this is why his books are so long. In the passage we started with, Augustine compared Adam and Eve before the fall to newborn babies who are neither wise nor foolish. But actually, he does think that babies are foolish, in the sense of being at the mercy of their bodily desires. In a famous passage from his Confessions, Augustine points to the evident signs of sin in even the youngest humans, giving the example of a baby who's jealous that his brother is being nursed by their mother. The point is made at greater length and with more theological context in another work called On the Merits and Forgiveness of Sins and on the Baptism of Infants, written in 411 to 12, so about a couple of decades after On Free Choice of the Will. Here, Augustine devotes a whole chapter to the ignorance of infants, which he glosses as the darkness of their rational intellect. This would explain their appalling behavior, which we forgive simply because they are so young. The upshot is that for fallen humans, so not just babies, but all of us, Augustine's responses to the problem of evil and the problem of ignorance are one and the same. Evil just is, or at least stems from, ignorance, in the sense synonymous with foolishness. In the Confessions, Augustine famously offers a subtle psychological analysis of this state, pointing out, for instance, that those who are dominated by desire wind up hating truth. He says, because they do not wish to be deceived, they do not wish to be persuaded that they are mistaken, and so they hate the truth for the sake of the object which they love instead of the truth. But this response will not do for the prelapsarian Adam and Eve. While they lacked wisdom, which would have prevented their sinning, they also lacked foolishness, which would have guaranteed their sin. Elsewhere, for instance, in his City of God, Augustine emphasizes that Adam and Eve were initially free from sinful impulses like lust and fear, which so dominate us in our fallen state. For this situation, Augustine needs a different epistemic theodicy, one that accounts for the mere lack of inborn wisdom, as opposed to the actual presence of false beliefs and a concomitant propensity to sinful desire. This is clearly a problem Augustine takes seriously. Some pages before the passage we began with, he has already imagined an objector saying that God ought to have made us so that we would always enjoy his unchangeable truth, so that we would never will to sin. Notice here the same intellectualist assumption we've seen before, that if one were to have an adequate intellectual grasp of the truth, one would never turn away from the real eternal good and toward the spurious goods of the body. So the question here is, so we're fallen, right? But Adam and Eve are not fallen before they commit the original sin. So why doesn't God just give them knowledge of the good, thus effectively forcing them to choose it? Because if he did that, they would never have made the bad choice and we wouldn't be fallen. This would clearly have been better, right? So that's the question. Augustine's answer to this prelapsarian version of the problem of ignorance is simply that the complaint is presumptuous. Of course, a creature created with enduring wisdom would be better than humans. But whoever said that humans have the right to be created with every possible perfection? Humans are still very good, after all, not least because they have the capacity for knowledge and for good use of the will. To lament the existence of such beings because we can imagine even better beings would be like complaining about the earth because it is not as good as the heavens. And by the way, this is also Descartes' answer to the problem of ignorance. In just one of the many signs of his profound debt to Augustine, there's a whole book by Stephen Menn about this, that is Descartes' use of Augustine. Descartes says, "I have no cause for complaint on the grounds that the power of understanding or the natural light which God gave me is no greater than it is. For it is in the nature of a finite intellect to lack understanding of many things, and it is in the nature of a created intellect to be finite." Of course, Augustine, whose respect for divine omnipotence is so great that he claims that God can even make impossible things true, so actually he could have given triangles more than 3 sides without making them be squares or pentagons. He could just make triangles be triangles and have 4 sides. If you can wrap your mind around that, then you should give tomorrow night's lecture. So Augustine thinks that God can make impossible things true, but he obviously wouldn't deny that God could have created something like a human, but with a better nature, one that is immune to sin. So neither Augustine nor Descartes deny that God could have done this. But the fact that God could have done this doesn't mean that he was obligated to do it. Both Augustine and Descartes simply accept God's choice to give us the limited nature that we have. It is a nature appropriate to the role we are intended to play in creation, a nature that does not come with perfect knowledge, but does allow us the possibility of discovering truth and achieving wisdom. Since this part of Augustine's epistemic theodicy does not turn at all on invocation of original sin, we may hope to find a similar solution in non-Christian authors, who of course lack that distinctively Augustinian theological doctrine, which makes things a lot easier for them, actually. That's why there's no Protestant Reformation in Judaism or Islam. Well, maybe that's not the only reason, but at least one. We'll get into that later. Okay, or we can get into it in the Q&A if you want. Okay, so we might think, well, perhaps this idea, so the reason we're ignorant is because we're created with a limited nature, would turn up in some non-Christian authors as well, and it does. So we find it in the work of the Jewish religious scholar and philosopher Saadia Gaon. He originally hailed from Egypt, but moved to Iraq, where he served as a head, or Gaon. So Gaon is a title. It means the head of a rabbinic academy, in this case in the city of Sura in Iraq. One of the most significant and multifaceted of Jewish intellectuals in the Islamic world, Saadia translated the Hebrew Bible into Arabic, wrote the oldest surviving Hebrew grammar, and commented on several books of the Bible. Our focus here, though, will be on his most obviously philosophical work, the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs, Kitab al-Amanat wal-I'tiqadat. It bears the influence of Greek-Arabic philosophical translations and Islamic theological ideas, both of which were current in the Iraq of this time. He was most powerfully influenced by the Islamic theologians called the Mu'tazilites. They styled themselves the people of Tawheed, which means unity, and justice. So they're Ahl al-Tawheed wal-Adl, so that means the upholders of divine unity and divine justice. This refers to their rigorously negative approach to divine attributes, which is designed to safeguard divine oneness. So the idea is that divine wisdom and power are not additional things distinct from God. They're somehow identical to God. And then they also have a defense of God's justice by upholding the reality of human free will. So the idea here would be God is just when he punishes us because it's our fault that we did things wrong, because we had free will. They argued that if God is to be just, he cannot punish the righteous and reward the wicked, nor can he punish agents who lacked the freedom to decide between righteousness and wickedness. Other theologians objected to the subordination of God to an independent, rationally discoverable law of justice and duly polemicized against the Mu'tazilites. But Saadia was certainly not among those critics. To the contrary, he fully endorsed the Mu'tazilite position on free will, as well as their negative stance on the divine attributes. This gives us some background for understanding why he explores our topic of epistemic theodicy, not far into his book of Doctrines and Beliefs. Like the Mu'tazilites, he believes in a God who is perfectly rational, who never acts unjustly or even frivolously, that is, without good reason. An example that's often given of acting without good reason is twirling your beard, which I can't do, but you could. The gentleman in front could do this. That would be frivolous behavior. God doesn't act like that. Okay. If that explains the doctrinal context, the immediate textual context is provided by his introduction to the work as a whole. Anticipating Maimonides' rationale for writing the more famous Guide for the Perplexed, Saadia explains that his aim is to dispel doubts that plague some of his co-religionists. He will be like a strong swimmer who rescues the drowning and brings them back safely to shore. We then get an admirably clear formulation of the problem of ignorance. Perhaps someone may ponder over the fact that the Creator, great and exalted, allowed these obscurities and doubts among those he has created. Given Saadia's rationalism, he needs to find a good explanation for this, lest God be convicted of injustice. The other kind of theologians in this period who disagree with the Mu'tazilites don't have a problem here, because they would say, well, God does whatever he wants. Why are you complaining? Discussion over. right? But the Mu'tazilites and Saadia, who agrees with them, thinks, no, we need to find a way to make God sort of conform to our expectations of justice. So that's the project. His answer is not unlike Augustine's epistemic theodicy for the prelapsarian state, so the state before the original sin, in that it appeals to the nature of humans rather than to any bad choice that humans have made. He says, we say that the very fact of their being creatures on its own necessitates their being prey to obscurities and false suppositions. This is because, by the character created in them, for every activity they perform, they need a period of time in which to complete their activity, one part after another. Knowledge, which is one of these activities, inevitably needs to work this way too. Now, instances of knowledge among humans at first begin from things that are confused, ambiguous, and obscure, but by the capacity of reason in them, they are able to purify and extract the instances of knowledge over a period of time until obscurity is banished from them and the knowledge is extracted for them without the ambiguity of any doubt. He goes on to compare this to the practice of crafts, like building houses and weaving cloth, which likewise must proceed bit by bit. So it is with knowledge. Faced with numerous obscurities, whenever the human reflects and considers, the obscurities grow fewer until one reaches a last state in which each object of inquiry is extracted for him and he remains free with no obscurity and no doubt. So that's quite a long text. You would think he's pretty much made his point, but he now launches into a long-winded and pedantic illustration, which I must admit is not atypical for his writing. I know that sounds like I'm complaining that they all write too long, but Umasvati writes too short. So he'll kind of balance things out. So what he does here is to imagine that we're looking for a demonstration. So that would mean like a scientific proof, a la Aristotle. And so what we want is a scientific proof. So what we do is we begin with all sounds that anything can make, because a demonstration would be a sound, because we're trying to produce the utterance of a demonstrative syllogism, right? So now we have to discard the irrelevant sources of sounds, right? Like this is not a proof, right? So that's not going to count. He gives the examples of thunder and noises made by animals. So that leaves us with the noises made by humans. Demonstration will be one of those, right? You can see what I mean about this is kind of pedantic. This, by the way, goes over like a page and a half, this sort of elimination procedure. So he works through all the various noises that humans can make, and he excludes all the ones that aren't proofs. And finally, we reach the class of assertions, namely the ones that provide proof either positively or by reductio ad absurdum. And from among these, we take the demonstrations that are correct. That's how we find a proof. Just that easy, right? Now, so this obviously seems pretty weird as a picture of philosophical investigation. It's as if one were wondering what to have for dinner and began, well, it should be a physical object. And among the physical objects, it would be one that would fit into my stomach, and then you would go from there, right? But the line of thought is illuminating nonetheless, because it brings out so forcefully Saadia's understanding of the problem of ignorance. Intuitively, we might have assumed that the problem is our being born as a kind of blank slate, lacking the knowledge we need and thus having to take on the burden of acquiring it. But Saadia thinks otherwise. His analysis is rather the reverse. We are by nature supplied with a confusion of mixed-up ideas, and scientific inquiry consists in the refinement or extraction of knowledge from that bewildering mass of information. This process is described later in the work and in similar terms. One should start from sense experience of bodies, and then, as he says, reach a higher degree of subtlety by seeing that bodies exhibit such abstract features as accident and quantity. And then he says, the inquiring person increases in refinement from one knowledge to another until he arrives at an object of knowledge beyond which there is none further. The impossibility of going still further has three possible explanations. One is that the objects of knowledge simply come to an end. They cannot be infinite to prevent a regress. The other two are more relevant to us. The inquirer may have a finite power for acquiring knowledge, or there may be inbuilt limits to the process because it is based on sensation, which is a finite resource. These considerations add a further dimension to Saadia's epistemic theodicy. What we learned before is that knowledge is a creaturely activity, and all such activities are realized only part after part. We've had no explicit justification for that claim, but the reference to a need for a period of time to do this is suggestive. Saadia may be thinking that whereas the eternal and unchanging God always already realizes every perfection that belongs to him, the perfections of creatures can only be acquired through a temporal process, rather than being received immediately as soon as they exist. To this, we can now add the further point that humans are finite in power and finite with regard to the experiences they manage to enjoy. These factors place a limit on what humans could possibly know. It should be added that for Saadia, there's no guarantee that we will fall into error. So we're not like post-lapsarian humans who will always get things wrong. Mistakes occur at the level of both sensation and reason, either because of unfamiliarity with the subject at hand, either because of unfamiliarity with the subject at hand and the methods of investigation, in other words, because you're not good enough at logic, or because the inquirer is lazy and reaches a conclusion before the inquiry is complete. Thus, at the end of his discussion of the problem of ignorance, he says that the vexed, ignorant person should not blame God for plunging him into doubts because it's his fault if he fails to inquire properly. As for asking God to spare him from the need for inquiry, Saadia restates that this would be an impossible demand. It is impossible that just one of the inquirer's acts in one fell swoop eliminates obscurity, as this would depart from the character of creatures, and he is created. To be by nature free of doubt is to be equal to God, and no creature can be God's equal. So, like Augustine's prelapsarian humans, humans on Saadia's account are born ignorant only in the sense that they lack knowledge, not in the sense that they are dominated by bodily desire and false belief, as Augustine's fallen humans are. Saadia thus compares ignorance to darkness, which is merely the absence of light. He adds, if ignorance had its own reality, like knowledge, then the ignorant person could never become knowing. Instead, knowledge and ignorance would be combined in the same part. We find the same thought in the only medieval Jewish thinker who looms larger in the tradition than Saadia, namely the aforementioned Maimonides. In his Guide for the Perplexed, he notes, the human is not just given utmost perfection straight away. Rather, perfection is in him only potentially. Interestingly, though, Maimonides says something different about the situation of Adam. The first man was born with perfect reason, but it was stripped from him as punishment for his disobedience. This question of Adam is something to which we'll return at the end of the lecture. Okay. We've now seen two attempts to respond to the problem of ignorance, which correspond to two familiar responses to the problem of evil. We've seen a free will defense, which was Augustine on the ignorance of fallen humans, and we've seen an appeal to the limitations of human nature, which we've also seen in Augustine to account for the case of Adam and Eve before the fall, and we've seen in Saadia applying it to human ignorance in general, including us. A third familiar theodicy for the problem of evil is the other one I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. While things may look bad at the local level, the universe as a whole is good. Indeed, it's as good as it can possibly be. In European philosophy, this solution was pioneered by the Stoics, then picked up by Neoplatonists, and of course it reappears in early modern philosophy, most famously in Leibniz. But to stick with the Neoplatonists, Plotinus uses the Stoic comparison of the universe to a play that needs to have some evil characters in it. So if you think about the character, okay, this guy's like the mustache twirling villain, who I guess is participating in the same pointless activity. I only just thought of that. So that character is lamentable, but he's somehow playing his role in the story as a whole, right? So he needs to be there. And the same thing would be true of, for example, earthquakes or disease. An analog in the domain of knowledge might go something like this. Yes, there is ignorance, but each case of ignorance contributes something to a perfect epistemic whole. That might sound odd, but it will make more sense once I call attention to another feature of the two epistemic theodicies we've considered so far, namely that they understand ignorance in two different ways, either as lack of knowledge or in terms of actual false beliefs. So you can lack knowledge by just not believing anything, right? Having a false belief is a positive state in the sense that you do believe something, it's just wrong. As we just saw, Saadia seems to understand ignorance in the former way, since he thinks that we come into the world with resources for acquiring knowledge. In particular, we have sensation, but we need much time and effort to do so. Erroneous belief arises only when one fails to use the resources of sensation well, and this is always the fault of the person who makes the mistake. By contrast, Augustine associates ignorance with actively false beliefs. These two possibilities then amount to the absence of knowledge on the one hand and a state opposed to knowledge on the other hand. But there's a third way that one can understand ignorance, namely as a case where one does have some knowledge, but the knowledge is inadequate. Here we see the possibility of an epistemic theodicy that corresponds to the holistic solution to the problem of evil, the sort of Stoic-style answer. The reason for ignorance would be that people grasp only part of the truth. Perfect knowledge, if it is possible, would instead be holistic in nature, just like the goodness of the universe. And you might be thinking, what in the world would that look like? So I'm going to tell you. We find a particularly nuanced version of this view in an ancient Indian thinker from the Jain tradition called Umasvati. Or rather, we find it in both his fundamental work, the Tattvartha Sutra, which means something like the Sutra on what is, and the commentaries written on it. These actually include a commentary written by Umasvati himself. You can all try this. The fellow academics, if you're waiting for someone to write a commentary on your most important work, wait no longer. Just go do it. There's no rule against it. So this might look kind of wacky, but actually self-commentary was a frequent practice in Indian intellectual history. The reason being that authors were accustomed to working with highly compressed texts, often called sutras, just like this one. Sutra means thread. And they consist of dense and difficult statements that really are incomprehensible unless they're elaborated by exegetical commentary. The commentary is often called a bhashya. Pretty well all of the Brahminical, I'm going to use the word Brahminical a bit, so that means in the Vedic tradition, so like the Vedas, Upanishads, and then the schools that follow on from that. That's what I mean by Brahminical, because these are the Brahmins doing it, as opposed to the Jains and Buddhists, who are critics of that culture and intellectual tradition. And this is very common in the Brahminical philosophical schools. A lot of them have a founding work, like the Nyaya Sutra is the founding work of the Nyaya school, the Yoga Sutra is the founding work of the Yoga school, and so on. I like how there's like 3 people here who are like, yeah. Okay, and then actually, in a way, each philosophical school is nothing more nor less than a commentary tradition on that text, okay? We could go into why this is the case, and it's actually something that appears in a lot of pre-modern philosophical traditions. I have a lot to say about this, so feel free to ask later. But we're going to just focus on this one case, Umasvati. So he's, as I just said, he's not a Brahminical thinker. Like the Buddhists, the Jains are renouncers who formed a dissident religious and philosophical tradition, highly critical of Vedic culture, rejected the pretensions of that culture's priestly Brahmin class, their practices of ritual, and so on. In tomorrow's lecture, I'll be touching on what is probably the most famous aspect of Jainism, namely its radical commitment to that's actually the third lecture. In tomorrow's lecture, I'm going to talk about their critique of ritual, and mostly I'm focusing on a defense of Vedic ritual in the Bhagavad Gita. And in the third lecture, I'll talk about Jain nonviolence, but very briefly. For now, though, I want instead to consider the aspect of Jain thought that has received the most attention from philosophers, their perspectival approach to knowledge and reasoning, the so-called theory of standpoints. The Jains diagnose all rival philosophical schools as having what they called a one-sided understanding of reality. For example, Brahminical thinkers believed in an unchanging eternal self, while Buddhists did not believe that there is a self at all, instead identifying what is apparently a person with a shifting aggregate of mental and physical phenomena that have no unifying core. Considering this debate, The Jains decided that both sides were partially right. There is an enduring self, but it is subject to constant change. So instead of an enduring, unchanging self, or no self at all, just change, they said, well, our position's in the middle. So to grasp the whole truth about the self is to understand it from more than one perspective. And there are a lot of perspectives. The Jains tried to put a number on it, in one instance claiming that there are 363 different religious and philosophical views, each of which approaches reality from a limited angle. Another idea was that the standpoints are in principle unlimited, since there could be one for each and every person. But to keep things simple, the Jains identified 7 most important standpoints, which range over metaphysical, pragmatical, and linguistic concerns. To grasp the whole truth would be to go beyond these limited perspectives and grasp everything from every possible standpoint. As one might expect, this is not something given to just anyone, not even philosophers. Or maybe I should say it's especially not given to philosophers, because they're prone to developing and doggedly defending one-sided theories. Those few figures who have managed this multi-perspectival global perspective, or the perspective which embraces all perspectives, are called Ford makers, since they show the way for the rest of us to cross over to liberation like fording a river, fording the river of ignorance. One of these Ford makers was Mahavira, a contemporary of the Buddha who was traditionally seen as the founder of the Jain belief system. Here, liberation means freedom from the cycle of rebirth, a goal pursued by many ancient Indian belief systems. This is an interesting thing about Indian philosophy and religion. They're trying to die. That's the goal, to get out of this endless cycle of rebirth. So long as we're trapped in a one-sided view of the world, we will never achieve this goal. As Umasvati says, liberation comes only through enlightened worldview, knowledge, and conduct. While he allows that the first of these items, enlightened worldview, can arise spontaneously in some cases, enlightenment usually requires long ascetic practice. This facilitates the achievement of the anekanta vada, meaning literally not one-sided doctrine. Just now I said that from the Jain point of view, the Brahminical thinkers and Buddhists are both partly right, for example, about the self. But it is at least as important that they are both partly wrong. As one of Umasvati's commentators, Siddha Sena, explains, all the standpoints are right in their own respective spheres, whereas if they are taken to be refutations each of the other, then they are wrong. But a man who knows the non-one-sided nature of reality never says that a particular view is absolutely wrong. Thus, we could say that one-sided knowledge is, from another perspective, ignorance. For instance, the Brahminical philosopher understands that the self is enduring, but falsely thinks of it as unchanging, so is both knowledgeable and ignorant about the self. I think it's important to realize that the Jains were indeed accusing other traditions in India of ignorance, since it casts some doubt on an idea that their epistemology was a kind of olive branch held out to these other traditions. It's often been suggested that the Jain epistemology was an application of their ethic of nonviolence. They didn't want to be so harsh as to disagree outright with their opponents, right? They're not super nonviolent. You might have seen like pictures of them sweeping insects out of the way while they walk along because they don't want to tread on the insects, right? So they're avoiding all nonviolence. So they don't want to disagree with anybody. They're like, oh man, well, you know, you're kind of right. You're not exactly right, you know. But I think this is wrong. So this sort of ironic interpretation, it really doesn't fit with the polemical nature of the texts that we find when they are in actual dispute with their rivals, which goes so far that in one story, a Jain philosopher debates so ferociously and at such length with an opponent that the opponent drops dead. He's not killed by the Jain like physically, but we've all felt like this, right? The Jains wanted to escape suffering, and that includes escaping suffering fools. Umasvati says that someone who is trapped in one-sided thinking is deluded, and that a deluded person may as well be insane because they cannot tell true from false. Deluded people go wrong because they assert propositions one-sidedly and without qualifications, which makes their statements false, although only partially false. The Jains developed a sophisticated logical analysis to show how this error may be avoided. They list the acceptable forms of assertion as follows. In a sense it is, in a sense it is not. In a sense it is, and in a sense it is not. In a sense it is unassertable. In a sense it is, in a sense it is unassertable. In a sense it is not, in a sense it is unassertable. In a sense it is, in a sense it is not, and in a sense it is unassertable. Two things leap to the eye here. First, in addition to affirmation and negation, so we have it is not, we have the idea of unassertability, which indicates that a given predicate can be neither affirmed nor denied. Category mistakes, like if you ask, is the number 4 heavy or not heavy? Well, neither. So this is heavy is unassertable of 4, not yes or no. So that might be a good example. That's one thing, but maybe more important for us here is the pervasive use of the qualifier siat, whose basic meaning is maybe, but which I'm here translating as in a sense. Sometimes people translate it as arguably. Other interpreters have plausibly suggested that in the hands of the Jains, it's just an untranslatable technical term. But the point is that all of these propositions are true, but only in a sense, right? And all these other philosophers are saying things that are in a sense true, as if they were just true. The enlightened person must then have holistic knowledge in the sense that they can see reality from every perspective at once, while also balancing each perspective by other standpoints. We can see this from the list of assertions, where types 1 and 2 would already constitute advances on delusional, unqualified assertions like just saying it is, or it is not. These two types are then combined into the still more non-one-sided assertion, type 3. Well, in a sense, it both is and is not, right? The holistic understanding of a figure like Mahavira, the Ford maker who founded the Jain tradition, was expressed by saying that he actually possessed omniscience. Umasvati says that this is one of 5 kinds of knowledge, along with experience and testimony, and the more exotic clairvoyance and telepathy. The commentary to this passage says, omniscience refers to knowledge of all substances in all their modes, past, present, and future. As Paul Dundas has written, omniscience is a transcendent knowledge and vision which gives direct and simultaneous access to all forms of reality in the universe in every temporal and spatial dimension. This may seem, to put it mildly, extravagant, but as Ramji Singh pointed out in a study of the Jain theory of omniscience published about 50 years ago, it was common in classical Indian thought to say that omniscience is possible, so also in other schools. Singh finds this claim in the Buddhist and in the Brahminical tradition, indeed in pretty well every school of thought apart from the materialist Charvakas. But omniscience played an especially key role in the Jains because it links their ethics to their epistemology. Through ascetic practices, it is possible to eliminate karma, realizing the potential for knowledge that is the essential characteristic of the soul. Even more than Saadia, then, the path to knowledge is, for the Jains, about elimination. Here, elimination not of what is irrelevant to leave only what is true, but elimination of karmic bondage. Since this process automatically brings growth in knowledge, it involves the steady falling away of one-sided thinking. The idea that omniscience gives a figure like Mahavira access to past and future and to places that he's never been actually fits perfectly with that idea. To be cognitively tied to a given place and time is to be restricted to a limited perspective. And Mahavira's knowledge transcends all limited perspectives because he sees the world from every perspective. In closing, I want to make a couple of general points about the solutions we've seen to the problem of ignorance. One I've already anticipated at the beginning of the lecture. If ignorance were just one among many evils in human life, then it would not need such careful attention, a theodicy of its very own. But in the authors we've looked at, ignorance is not just any evil. Insofar as there's a problem of evil for the Jains, it comes down to the question, why are we all condemned to the cycle of rebirth with all its miseries? The answer is that a one-sided understanding of the world is bound up with the acquisition of karma, and karma keeps us coming back for one life after another. As Singh comments, delusion is at the root of all evils and is also the cause of worldly existence. Similarly, the early Augustine's intellectualism is evident throughout On Free Choice of the Will, a text that makes ignorance in one sense, namely lack of knowledge, the necessary condition for a sinfulness that it equates with ignorance in another sense, namely false belief. As for Saadia, he also tends towards intellectualism, arguing that sinfulness is always the result of a choice made by the rational soul, and denying that the soul can be turned towards wickedness against its will, as by bodily desires. The upshot is that all three authors seem to leave very little, if any, space between the problem of evil and the problem of ignorance. To solve one is to solve the other. My second concluding point is that all three traditions build into their epistemic theodicies the idea that ignorance can ultimately be escaped. As we've just seen, Mahavira and the other Ford makers clearly illustrate this. In Judaism, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible play a similar role, and especially Moses, who Saadia says was unique in knowing God face to face, whereas the other prophets received a message from angels. Maimonides also singles out Moses as having achieved the greatest knowledge available to humans, one that no one before or since has managed. As for Christianity, there's obviously the case of Christ, his knowledge is a really complicated situation, but even without getting into that case, we might consider Adam. Though Augustine denies that Adam had the wisdom that would have ensured his obedience, he thinks that Adam and Eve before the fall had perfectly realized human natures, and that Adam's being tasked with naming the animals in the Garden of Eden shows his natural knowledge. Which brings us back to the 17th century. Ringkomposition, as the Germans say. So this idea was considerably expanded around the time of Descartes. A wide array of early modern thinkers, for instance Francis Bacon, believed that Adam had perfectly functioning cognitive faculties. We lack such faculties because of original sin. In a paper on this 17th century development, Peter Harrison has linked it to the rise of modern science. He says, experimental natural philosophy was a means of imposing discipline on both an errant natural world and on fallen human minds. We fallen humans need to work hard and observe the world closely, including with artificial instruments, like the microscope or the telescope, to achieve the scientific understanding that for Adam quite literally came naturally. This dramatically illustrates the longevity of Augustine's free will defense to the problem of ignorance. More generally, it's striking that in all three traditions, it is distinctively religious figures, Ford makers, prophets, Adam, and Christ, who are made exempt from the toils of ignorance. True and effortless knowledge is the province of divinity and those rare humans touched by its light. The rest of us remain, to a greater or lesser extent, in the dark. Thanks.
So before we open up on the floor for questions, I just want to remind everyone that we have a lecture tomorrow at 5 o'clock at 101 Roos. It's on Hill House Avenue, and then on Wednesday in LC. Same time, 5 o'clock.
Okay. Questions? Yes.
Yes. Thank you so much. In the case of the problem of evil, the badness of thank you for this wonderful lecture. In the case of problem of evil, the badness of the problem, or why God should not allow evil, is sort of worn on its sleeve. Evil is bad. Mm-hmm. In the case of ignorance, not so much. Not every type of knowledge is useful to me. The wheels of a certain Amtrak train, I don't think that I have to know. I don't think it will contribute much to me. Yeah. And so not every type of ignorance is bad. Mm-hmm. So why wouldn't anyone go to that extent and say this, like, well, you don't have to know everything.
Right, okay. Actually, I've taken some trains in the last few days here in the States, and I don't think Amtrak knows either. So I think one of the three authors, the one I discussed who has the most direct answer to that would be Augustine, because he is very clear that the kind of knowledge he's interested in is only knowledge of the good, right? So actually that's why, that's how he can square the circle of saying things about Adam. He doesn't really say them about Eve, right? But he says them about Adam, and we could perhaps ascribe this to Eve as well. Same with these 17th century guys, they're interested in Adam. So they will say, well, yes, Adam kind of has this scientific knowledge, right? So for example, he names the animals. So he's a biologist, right? Perfect biologist. But he doesn't know the good. If he knew the good, then because Augustine's sort of thinking like a Stoic at this point in his career, then he would, of course, choose it, right? So that would be one kind of answer. Another kind of answer, though, which I think you see a lot in the tradition, is to reject your assumption that there might be useless knowledge. And the reason why your assumption is plausible is that you're assuming that the purpose of knowledge is something like to get stuff done, right? Like, I don't need to know how many wheels are on the train to take the right train from New Haven to New York, right? But there's lots of reasons to deny that. So in Aristotle, for example, you have the idea that knowledge is desired for its own sake, like eyesight, as he says. You have the idea, which is very much taken up in later authors, you have the idea that by knowing, we're realizing the potential perfection of our minds, right? So we're becoming more and more perfect the more we think. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the Muslim commentator on Aristotle, even says that people who don't acquire scientific knowledge are, in a sense, humans in name only. They're more like animals because they haven't used the distinctively human property or capacity, right? So that would be one way of blocking your assumption. And then a final way of blocking it would be to say that all knowledge is giving us an appreciation of nature and thus allowing us to understand God's purpose or God's majesty or something. So I think actually, even though what you sort of said at the beginning, well, not all knowledge is worth having, because it would depend, right? Although that sounds plausible at first blush, actually I think most pre-modern philosophers would reject that assumption.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I was wondering that of the three options, the free will, defense of God, the appeal to our limited nature, and the holistic, listed those three. I wonder whether there was a fourth, or maybe under the second one, a limited nature, there's another dimension to it. And this touches on something that Descartes says, and you put a part of the fourth meditation today. But you know, it's not clear that it's a limitation of our nature that's getting God off the hook for Descartes, because Descartes considers, you know, it could be that even given our limited knowledge, and God could still make the case that even given our limited knowledge, without infringing on our free will, God could still make the case that we would know everything we needed to know in life. We wouldn't be omniscient then, our free will wouldn't be infringed, and we still have limited natures. And so couldn't God have done that, Descartes asked? And Descartes asked himself, and Descartes says, well, yeah, sure, God could have done that because God's omnipotent. And why didn't he do that, he asked? I don't know, right? Because God's incomprehensible. So the incomprehensibility of God is playing a big role at that point in Descartes' response to the problem of intellectual evil, as it were.
Right.
And maybe that's an offshoot of the limited nature response, but it's really Descartes saying, like, even given our limited nature, God could still give us all this knowledge. And then I don't know why, because we can't understand God's actions, why he didn't do that.
Yeah, that's right. So, and actually, it's similar to what Descartes says about free will and its compatibility with divine foreknowledge. So sometimes it looks like he might have a solution in mind, but sometimes he says, oh, I agree, this is a mystery.
Descartes says in Principles, Part 1, Section 40, 41, 42, he says, hey, yeah, I know how to reconcile our freedom with God's omnipotence. So I don't know, but we know we're free. You know?
Yes, right. So, I mean, I guess my view of that sort of answer is that it's not really a theodicy. So a theodicy to me is some kind of story about why we find ourselves in the predicament, rather than just a throwing up of the hands, however principled, as to the problem of solving it, right? I mean, I think actually in a way, I mean, it's interesting to consider for what kind of thinker would that move be acceptable, right? So for example, I mentioned in the Islamic tradition that there's this debate between Mu'tazilites and their opponents, mostly the Ash'arites, and the Ash'arites would say that. They would say, I mean, who are we to judge what God is doing or not doing, right? And when the Mu'tazilites said that they were the upholders of divine justice, what they were doing was taking upon themselves the responsibility to give a better answer than that, right? So I mean, as we'll see in all three lectures, there's this sort of interesting question about like how can religious thinkers sort of weaponize philosophy in order to answer questions like this, right? And then there's this kind of more and less modest thing. So you might settle for a more or less modest story, but I think that move of saying, well, gosh, I just have no idea, is maybe something that would have been, I mean, obviously Descartes was a pious Catholic, but I think of that as a very characteristic thing of like post-Reformation culture in some ways. Like, you know, it's because it's so much like Calvin's answer to the question, why does God damn some people and save others? So that's a kind of answer that had been made available in the 16th century that Descartes helping himself to there. And it's an interesting question, how far you can go back finding that kind of answer.
You're
Right.
saying that when you make that kind of answer, you're checking out of the theodicy business. You're no longer giving
Exactly.
theodicy.
Yeah.
You're doing something else.
Right. Yeah, to refuse to give a theodicy is not a theodicy. Why don't you just decide who's... You got the mic.
Hey, wow, that's pretty strong. I've wanted to ask, why didn't they appeal to the following line of reasoning? If all of us were exempt from the problem of ignorance, then all of us would have been like Christ or Adam.
Mm-hmm.
But it can't be that all of us will be like Christ or Adam, divine. So
Yeah.
we're not. So we're all inflicted,
Mm-hmm.
except like a few minor exemptions, which are divine. Or
Right.
so
Yeah.
that's kind of one theodicy you could give.
Mhm.
It doesn't begin with us being limited. It begins with we don't want to get too close to perfection.
Right.
And then the other question is that it seems to me like a distinction that could have been made between the two problems is you could have a world where everybody is like maximally epistemic in their, everybody's perfectly epistemic. And in that world, there won't be any like redundant epistemic, ignorance coming in. But in a world where everybody's still like good and good to each other and good to animals and good to everything, you could have a natural disaster killing people.
Mhm.
And so the barrier of goodness and ignorance is the world and not, society or people or whatever.
Yeah, right. Okay, so in the first question, I think that's really just a version of the second answer. Because what you're saying is, well, we don't want normal humans to be on the level of Christ, right? Well, why not? Well, because Christ is God, right? So effectively what you're saying is, this is sort of like what I mentioned in passing about Aquinas. So Aquinas says, well, however God makes us, we will still be deficient relative to him, because otherwise we wouldn't be created beings. And similarly, Saadia, when he says, any created perfection will be achieved bit by bit or over time. So imperfection is kind of built into it, right? He would not say that about God, right? So although we didn't see the authors I mentioned explicitly making the point the way you did, I think it's very much like the second kind of theodicy. So on the second point, you're right that the problem of ignorance doesn't look like it would equate to the problem of evil with respect to natural evils, right? So the way this would often work is you can use the free will defense to get out of the problem of evil for evil caused by humans, right? It's because we're using our will badly. Oh, but what about earthquakes? What about plagues, etc., right? And then one way of getting out of that is to trace earthquakes and plagues back to original sin, right? The world has fallen along with us. So this would be a standard Augustinian line to take. But I think there is also a move you can make within the third option. So when you say, well, earthquakes are bad, why? That's not because of ignorance, right? So what's up with the earthquakes, God? God would say, well, you don't understand why there are earthquakes. So actually, if you had knowledge, if you weren't so ignorant, you wouldn't be complaining about the earthquakes because you know they need to be there, right? The air needs to be vented from below the earth, and that means that there will be earthquakes, something like that. So I think actually there's moves you can make with respect to natural evils, at least within 1 and 3. Maybe also within 2, because you could say, well, the created world itself is imperfect because otherwise it would be God. Right? Oh my God, like the whole audience has questions. This might take a while. Yeah.
So the overarching thesis with which you began was about an inversion where pre-modern religious thinkers, I think you said, were associated with skepticism, whereas modern religious thought is associated with the overcoming of skepticism.
Yeah.
That seems to presuppose that there is a univocal use of a term like religious or religious thinker, something that you said was not the case with scientists.
Yeah.
Scientists in the 19th century were. So I wonder if you would either want to defend this transhistorical notion of religion, how can we identify what religion is across history, or modify the thesis so that, for example, what we mean in this discourse today by religion might have come into being only at the same time as this new notion of a scientist, in which case the thesis might end up coming out a little bit different, which would not in any way detract from the interest of what you're doing. But I'm just curious about that.
Right. So the thing that surprised me most about your question is that it's only the 4th question. So when I was sort of thinking about how to set all this up, I thought, oh my God, someone's going to ask me what I think religion is. What am I going to say? And I mean, of course, there's a massive body of literature on what is religion, and it's not one I can easily escape because, as you'll see over the next couple of days, I'm going to be talking about things like the Confucians and the Mohists. And I mean, it's bad enough that I'm talking about the Jains, who are outside the Abrahamic traditions. So I'm kind of, and to be honest, this is kind of a rod I've made for my own back by my desire to talk about all these global traditions and connect it to the topic of the Terry lectures, right? So this is definitely a problem for me in terms of conceiving of the book project. And I was just talking to Jean about this at lunch, actually. And I think I said to you, I'm worried that someone will ask me what religion is, right? So your question is absolutely right on the money. So I think that my current thinking on this, and I need to think about this some more, maybe it will depend on what all I wind up concluding in the book. But my current thinking on this is that I can get away without defining religion in general if I say something like the following. At the core of the pre-modern, what I'm calling the pre-modern skeptical stance of religion, is something like a feeling of humility before the majesty and perfection of the divine, okay? And we can consider that to be a kind of religious impulse or mood. And that is something that we certainly find in all the traditions we talked about today. But we also find it in Confucianism. We even find it in Mohism, which is like highly rationalist and not obviously a religion at all, right? So I don't think I need to say that Confucianism is a religion or that even that Buddhism is a religion. If I can say that what all of these problems and issues are kind of have at their core is this idea of some kind of modesty with respect to what's going on with God, basically, and therefore, in some sense, what's going on with us, right? So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. But I think you're right that it's a really difficult problem in general and for me personally. Yeah. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, so I have one question that is motivated in 2 ways. The first motivation is that it seems to me like the thing that what you're describing has in common with like modern science isn't really skepticism in the sense of like pessimism about getting to the truth, because all of these views do say that you can get to the truth if you like work hard enough.
Yeah.
The thing that it seems to have in common is a kind of like making you responsible for your knowledge, or like saying that you have to work at it, which is kind of an optimism about like the efficacy of work in a way that like the Protestants and so on maybe are pessimistic about the efficacy of work. The work doesn't do anything. And I'm sort of wondering whether the theological thing. So the second motivation is that there seems to be a different way that you could throw up your hands and say, I don't know, which is that you do give a theodicy, you do explain why we're ignorant, and then you throw up your hands and say, well, the ignorance is explained and it's good, and so we don't have to fix it, right? And become a sort of mystic in that sense.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's some structural reason that you think that the people who give theodicies don't end up with that conclusion.
Right.
And yes, and in that sense, why it is that they have anything in common with modern
Yeah.
science. Yeah.
I mean, actually, that goes back to Michael's question, because in a sense, he was suggesting that that is Descartes' move, right? To say, well, once you understand that we're ignorant, then you also understand that we're bound to remain that way. And hey, that's just how it is. Maybe though, I'm not sure I agree with you that everyone I talked about thinks that you can actually get there. So certainly if you think that the ultimate goal would be to know things the way that God does, namely through omniscience, then the reason it's so shocking to us to see the Jains ascribing omniscience to Mahavira is that in Western traditions, I don't really like this talk of Western, but you know what I mean. So in maybe the Abrahamic traditions, it's verboten to say that humans could achieve omniscience just as much as it would be to say that we could achieve omnipotence, right? These are the province of God, right? So Augustine is very keenly aware of and constantly emphasizes the limits of what humans can achieve. And even Saadia, who's not as strong on that perhaps, is still saying, well, look, you can kind of make progress, but you'll never achieve the kind of knowledge that God has. And the same would be true of Maimonides, actually. Now, so the interesting case is the Jains here. And so a question that one could ask about the Jains is whether what they are advising the reader to do is aspire to be Mahavira, right? In other words, to become omniscient, or something less advanced than that. And it seems pretty clear that they're saying you should try to become something less advanced than that. You should just try to free yourself from as much karma as you can slough off during this life, because Mahavira is a divine figure, right? I mean, he's maybe worshipped isn't the right word, but they adopt an attitude of great reverence towards him, just like the Buddhists do for the Buddha. And I mean, that's a really interesting question, actually, about both Buddhism and Jainism. What philosophers think is possible for, let's say, your average monk in terms of trying to get as close as possible to Mahavira. I think it's kind of maybe an asymptotic relationship, so you're making progress all the time, and that's where you're headed, but you're not going to get there. And that would actually be very much like the attitudes towards these Abrahamic thinkers towards divine knowledge.
Thank you very much for your lecture this evening. I enjoyed these 3 vignettes on the problem of ignorance, and I particularly appreciate your emphasis on the recurring theme of intellectualism and its contribution toward your larger goal of inverting our correlations about religion and science and faith and doubt when it comes to the pre-modern world. Now, with the utmost respect as a scholar of global philosophy myself, I'd like to ask, what is the point of this kind of exercise in comparative philosophy? What kind of insight results from this kind of comparison in particular, instead of, say, any one of 3 deep dives into any of the 3 thinkers?
Right. Yeah, again, a question I thought I might get. So I think that there's maybe a difference between my actual motivation and the mode of presentation. So my actual motivation for global philosophy is perhaps twofold. One is the obvious one, which is that it's sort of politically important, right? Maybe it's more politically important every day more than it was yesterday at the moment, but it's like clearly saying something to do global philosophy and give equal weight to these different traditions, rather than saying, well, philosophy is basically a European phenomenon, and oh, look, we can find some things in India and China that remind us of that. Isn't that cool, right? So I think there's something, there's an important message to be gotten out by treating these things on a par with one another, and also starting from an abstract philosophical problem, right? Rather than, for example, starting with Plato, treating that as normative, and then saying, okay, can we find something in India that matches? So that's why I'm starting from we'll see all three talks are like this. They start from an abstract problem and then just go into the different traditions and see what they have to say about it. And in a way, it's not comparative, right? Because I'm not making them talk to each other. I'm just saying, how do these traditions answer the questions, right? So that's one way of thinking about what I'm doing. But the way in which what I'm doing in these lectures doesn't match my normal way of thinking about it is that normally I'm actually very, very strict about doing them one at a time. So I have these different, so Tom kindly mentioned the podcast, right, in the introduction. And in that project, I have, with co-authors often, I have these separate series on Africana, Chinese, Indian, Islamic philosophy. Islamic is a special case because, of course, it's very influenced by Greek philosophy. But if you leave that aside and think about the other three, when we were doing classical Indian philosophy, I actually said to Janardhan, let's never refer to European philosophy. And I think in the whole series / book, I think we only do it like twice because it was too hard to resist. Because I don't want to suggest that these traditions are only interesting because they remind us of something European, right? So in a way, there's a kind of tension between my desire to treat each one on its own and to sort of proselytize the cause of global philosophy. So really, I don't think of this as a comparative project. I think of it more as an opportunity to show, along with what many other scholars are doing, that this stuff has a lot of philosophical merit. That's really what I'm trying to do. So it's not really a comparative project in that sense.
I think we have time for one more question.
Oh dear, okay. Make it a good one.
One of the things I thought was very interesting about your talk was how you associated these different theodicies with different ideas of what ignorance is, as a lacking belief or an erroneous belief, or having only just a limited amount of a whole belief. And I was wondering, since all these people are sort of intellectualists, that they associate ignorance with something being bad and knowledge with something being good, if there are different conceptions of the good in these different traditions that determine how they're thinking about ignorance, and thereby what kind of solution that they offer. Or am I trying to, was that to force you to be comparative?
No, I think that's for sure the case. So, I mean, in a way, it depends what one means by comparative, but I mean, for sure, part of what I was doing here was sort of recognizing differences, right? I mean, this is something I always think about global philosophy. If they were all just saying the same thing in the end, then who would care, right? So as I always say, if Indian philosophy said the same thing as Greek philosophy, then you wouldn't need to study Indian philosophy, or more to the point, you wouldn't need to study Greek philosophy, right? So I think that we do find differences on this matter. So in particular, what the Jains are after is liberation from the cycle of rebirth, which is obviously not what's going on in Saadia or Augustine. Saadia and Augustine are much more similar because, there's a reason we use the phrase Judeo-Christian, right? But even here, even though we were looking at the pre-anti-Pelagian Augustine, there's definitely something going on in Augustine. I mean, the work is about the will, right? So it's about, can you orient your will towards God, right? And the intellectualism comes in only in respect of his kind of stoicizing view that to have the will oriented correctly is somehow bound up with having the correct beliefs, right? Whereas in Saadia, the intellectualism is much more straightforward because it looks like what he thinks you want is just knowledge, right? Knowledge of God, knowledge of the world, that's the project. I mean, it's called the Book of Doctrines and Beliefs for a reason. By the way, in conclusion, if I may, I just wanted to leave everyone with one final thought. which is, since we're talking about skepticism here, it's important within religion or not to think about whether you're really sure, right? That's the theme of a lot of what I'm going to be saying today, tomorrow, and the next day. So let me give you a candidate example of something you feel that you're really sure about. So you feel that you're really sure that you've just seen a lecture by Peter Adamson, right? But maybe you shouldn't be. Think about that.